All right, we should be live. Thank you for joining us today. Today, we're going to be taking a deep look at racism in Islam. Probably going to see some familiar material, uh, such as Muhammad's statements from the Hadith, but I think you're also going to see a lot of material that you've probably never seen before. If we only look at the life of Muhammad, we're just barely scratching the surface, as it seems as the centuries went on, Islam grew more and more racist. This contradicts the common narrative told to us today that racism is a modern invention, that it is something that Europeans came up with to justify the transatlantic slave trade. And while that might be true in the American European context, it seems that Islam beat Europe to the punch, that the Muslim world beat Europe to the punch and invented racism for much the same reasons, that they wanted to justify the slave trade, they wanted to justify their conquest of the African people, and thus they came up with reasons why claims of universal human value did not apply to the people they were conquering. We'll dive in after an opening prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this time together. We thank you for the technology that allows us to connect with people from all around the world. Sometimes we connect with believers and sometimes we connect with unbelievers, and we are very thankful for both audiences. We ask that everyone watching today, whether they are a Christian, a Muslim, or otherwise, that they approach the material with an open mind, that they not simply reject the material because it doesn't line up with their presuppositions. We ask that you be with us today, that you guide our discussion, and you prevent us from theological error. We ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So, my friend and sometimes contributor to this channel, Ask Truth, did a show a couple weeks ago where he had a panel, and he didn't do introductions at the start. He did them as we were going through it, and I liked the way that worked. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to dive straight into the presentation. Just so everyone's aware who we have here today, we have Lloyd DeYoung, regular contributor to the channel. We have Io from the Third Apology, and we have Haja from Resurrecting Truth. I'll give them a chance to say a little bit more about their own background, about what they do as we move along. But for now, let's dive straight in. I've titled today's presentation, Inventing Racism, the Secret History of Anti-Black Activity and Rhetoric in Islam. Because what we're going to see is that this doesn't match up with our understanding, that Europeans who've studied Islam, so-called Orientalists, they've often ignored or excused Islamic racism. So even people who are critical of Islam don't necessarily know what's in the history. And likewise, in the Muslim world, they have no interest in addressing this. It's a very important part of the apologetic of the Muslim preachers that Christianity is the anti-black religion. So you got to accept Islam because it's the religion for all people. So we're going to start with, before we get anything specific to Islam, I want to start with this question. What do we mean by ethnicity? What do we mean by race? And what's the difference between the two terms? I want to open this up to the panel. Since Lloyd joined first, we'll give him first say.
Actually, I've never thought in depth about these terms, and sometimes they seem rather arbitrary and artificial. I mean, they get misused and abused in culture today all the time, and especially the word racist. I believe that was a Russian propaganda term that was created about a century ago, and it's been heavily overused. So, yeah, I guess if I wanted to look up those terms, I would have to actually go and look at the scientific application of that, if there's a legitimate one, and how it may have changed over the last century or two.
Yeah, I think they're kind of the terms that we all have an idea what we're talking about, but we all would kind of struggle to define them. Io, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say, especially, having recently been in college and stuff, and hearing these kind of terms thrown around on a very, very regular basis, at least just from what I've been able to pick up, it seems that race can really be defined as, well, I would argue that a lot of it's arbitrary, especially when it comes to race, because a common term that you hear or common phrase that you hear is that there's only really the human race, and that these kind of lines that we draw between X race, Y race, Z race, whatever, are a lot more arbitrary. But then when you look at something like ethnicity, um, from how I understand it, that zeroes in way more on the cultural differences between groups, customs, practices, language, all of those type of things that make Russian culture versus Nigerian culture or Irish culture, right? But at heart, they're all humans. They're all part of the same race. I know a lot of liberal thinkers wouldn't really think race is the kind of universal term, especially with all of the rhetoric today. But that's what I would put out there.
And your thoughts, Hadja?
Um, oh, this is, I've never actually asked myself this question. Um, so I still look at race as just color. People use it a lot just to differentiate color, you know. And then I look at it, the ethnicity is more of the root, as I was saying the culture, of the people they're describing. So
Yeah,
I think nowadays, pretty much like liberal says, race is just a color, you know, it's like a stamp.
yeah, I think you're all on the right track. You all talked about how it's somewhat arbitrary, and this is because, it's kind of a modern invention, this idea of race. However, when we look at Islam, we'll say maybe it's not as modern as we think. Uh, I work for a organization that would be considered very liberal. I work in the homeless system, so it's very social oriented, and we have lots of trainings on this kind of stuff. And I think a good way to define ethnicity is a social group that shares a distinctive cultural or natural identity. So, you can be ethnically Russian, you can be ethnically a uh, drawing a blank here. You can be ethnically Muslim, right? You can be ethnically German. Now, race theory, as it was defined in the 18th century, is that there are inherited biological traits that cause these ethnic differences. That it's not just a matter of upbringing, but that there's some sort of what we would now call genetic basis to it. So thus you can look at someone, you can see how they look physically, and you can thus classify them into a specific race, which may or may not match their ethnicity, right? Someone can have an ethnic background where, say, they grew up in Mexico, and thus they have a Hispanic ethnic background, but they don't look like someone who grew up there. They say their family had immigrated from Nigeria. They they would be ethnically Hispanic, but they would be still race wise. They would be um, black or African or however you want to define the particular different races. So, given that this definition that race is a inherited biological trait that somehow corresponds with these ethnic differences and is observable physically, then the next question we need to ask is race real? And I'm going to suggest that it's both real and not real, but we'll get the panel's thoughts on that first. So this time we'll start with Io. What do you
Yeah.
feel about race? Do you think it's a real thing, or do you think it's something that human beings have imagined?
Well, I mean, based off of the definition that you just gave, I think it'd be pretty hard to argue that there aren't certain biological traits that are more akin to one group than other. So if you look at, the Chinese ethnicity or culture, whatever you wanted to call it, and then you look at eye shape or the size of lips or even like head shape or things like that you may not really think about. Those often can be tied to specific groups. So in that sense, I would say it's real. Um, I don't want to create these rigid barriers and say that this always has to be the case. I think that's really the key. But I do think that there are um, reliable and reasonable patterns that a person could expect when looking at different groups and their inherent characteristics. But at the same time, I also, it feels so hard for me to even say things like this because people who often define these terms and talk about them have such a monopoly over them in a way where they push it to the extreme of then, the kind of hyper division that you see a lot today. And so I'm trying to find that sweet spot, but that is what I would say.
Very good. Hadja?
It's a race wheel. um, I mean, these questions is like it makes you think. It's like questions that you really like never think of, to answer. But I think race in one side is real because it's a way of, people can identify other ethnicities or color or where they're from background. Somehow you can identify people like that. On the other hand, um, I think there's the 21st century, the definition of race has changed a lot. And I cannot find I cannot find a word that I want to use for this, but yes, race is real. I agree on that.
Very good. Your thoughts, Lloyd?
Oddly enough, recently I was looking at some of this. So, within biological factors, there are two things: the genotype and the phenotype. And going back historically, we've got the assertion by certain groups that there were distinctive human races, but these were used for the purposes of discriminating against them, especially going back, if you will, to the Enlightenment. This was used as an excuse for enslaving people or justifying slavery, and to justify the superiority of a given group. Whereas if the observable differences are called the phenotype, so this would be eye shape and so on, because we're all part of one, at the DNA level, at the genetic level, we're part of one group, although there are observable differences, and these differences are often, obviously it's a combination of nature plus environment. So given different environments, we're going to have different skin colors because that's the genes are producing melanin to protect the skin and so on. So the skin color doesn't necessarily make us different races. It's just a different physical expression based on environment. Some groups can handle milk, some don't. So there's these differences in Africa versus North Europe. So these don't really make the difference. It's one race. From a Christian point of view, the view that won out eventually was that we are all made in the image of God, so we are one race. The external differences are superficial, not considered substantive. So I think that that's, from a scientific point of view, that would be considered at least somewhat accurate, as well as from a Christian doctrinal point of view. Although it has been asserted in the recent past, that we are completely separate races, but these are just observable differences that are superficial, really, not actual deep genetic differences. So we're not separately races. I believe that should sum up my view.
That was a great answer, Lloyd.
That's well put there. That since the distinctions are somewhat arbitrary, you can just take people that meet certain characteristics and then group them together and say, yeah, they all share the same characteristic because we defined the race as being that characteristic to begin with.
And touching on what my brother said right now, the word race actually emerged in the mid 17th centuries.
The Enlightenment again.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're
That's
gonna
what it
get
says.
that. Yep, that is correct. We're gonna
Yeah.
take a look at that shortly. Did you want to say something, Io? It seemed like you may have wanted to.
Oh no, I was just looking at the comment on the screen.
Oh yeah, yeah. I put up this comment from Yaya. Are atheists a different race for believing to be monkeys? Of course, it was just a joke, but I thought it was pretty humorous, so I put it up there. So my answer, as I already said, is that it's both real and not real. And I think of this kind of the same way that we have this question sometimes asked of us as Christians. Doesn't the Bible imply that these other gods are real? And my answer is that they are real and not real at the same time. At the one time, the Bible says that there is only one God, there's one true God, so on and so forth, over and over again. At the other time, it does acknowledge them as if they matter, and that's because they do matter. They matter because, even though they're not actual real physical beings that exist in the real world, people are living their lives as if they are. They're living their lives as if this God matters, and they're devoting their time and their effort and their thoughts to this fake God. And that's kind of the way that I view race, that there aren't any real biological differences that correlate important traits, like say intelligence, for example, with skin color. And furthermore, as a Christian, it has already been stated a couple times that we believe that all people are created in the image of God, and we all have the same natural status before God. But at the same time, race does matter. Race is real because there are ethnic and cultural differences between different groups of people. And sometimes these correlate with what we call race because of human choice, both voluntarily and involuntarily. So both because of biological accident of different people living in different parts of the world and having different climates and evolving differently, and because of human sin, where we keep ourselves divided, where we create these barriers between ourselves because of our sinful nature. So people who look similar often live in close proximity, and they have a shared cultural background, and our sinful behavior keeps it that way, and thus creates this self-fulfilling race-based society where, because we decide race is a real thing, it becomes a real thing in some sense. So next I wanted to look at kind of the history of the invention of race. And this is the standard story that you'll learn in a cultural sensitivity class or whatnot. I took this from the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, but you could find the same basic outline in numerous places. All these words on the screen are their words. The concept of race as we understand it today evolved alongside the formation of the United States and was deeply connected with the evolution of two other terms, white and slave. Within the first decades of the 1600s, the first Africans were captured and brought to the American colonies as enslaved labor. Enslaved Africans were just one source of labor. So early on, there was slaves coming from a variety of places, not just from Africa. And there was people who were voluntarily entering into slave-like conditions as indentured servants because they wanted to get away from the poor living conditions they had in Europe, and that was an out that they had available to them. So in this early period, enslavement was not an automatic condition, nor did it uniformly apply to all Africans or African descended peoples. And importantly, enslaved was not necessarily a permanent life status, that you could begin life as a slave and you could earn your way out of that. The boundaries between groups, or what we now call races, were thus fluid, but over time this began to shift. By the late 1600s, there were more demands for labor and land to produce wealth as more Europeans came to the new continent. Indentured servitude was losing its attractiveness because Europeans could get land. They didn't need to enter into status as an indentured servant. So it became economically less profitable to utilize servants from European descent. White settlers began to turn to slavery as the primary source of forced labor, but even so, characterization of Africans in this early period were mostly positive. By the 1700s, new laws and societal norms linked Africans to perpetual labor, and the American colonies made formal social distinctions among its people based on appearance, place of origin, and heredity. The African physical distinctiveness marked their newly created subordinate position. To further separate the social and legal connections between lower class whites and African laborers, both enslaved and free, laws were put in place to control the interaction between the two groups. These laws created a hierarchy based on race. And I didn't put it on the slide here but a couple attempts of rebellion in America kind of really shaped things, where poor whites banded together with poor blacks and tried to rise up against the aristocratic elite who were ruling things. So in order to get control of the people, they kind of tried to put the people with dark skin aside and say that they are different. And there's more to it. This is just a brief summary, but gives you a good idea of where academia would place the origins of racism. Take some comments now. Beginning with you, Hedja, but first, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and what you do on YouTube? You're on mute. There you go.
Yeah, hi. My name is Haja Cross. I have a YouTube channel called Resurrecting Truth. So I'm just still trying to find my way. But the idea is to continue to expose Islam and its lies, and to connect that with everything that I've been through, being raised as a Muslim, growing up in the Islamic country, and also to share the word of God. And my channel is going to be based on women coming together, healing through trauma, for example, FGM, and all of that horrific stuff that comes in the Islamic world. We don't really talk about. So my YouTube channel is going to be a panel that women can actually come and freely talk about, and I can share also the information of things that I went through and things that I did to heal and to be able to put that behind me.
Excellent.
So
Yeah, the channel is linked in the video description, and I encourage everyone to check that out. So you grew up in Africa. So I'm curious as to your perspective of this. This is the American perspective, what I put here, as to how race or racism was invented. How does this relate to your experience growing up in Africa?
Well, racism is even among African people, because just looking at from my father's side and my mother's side, which my father is Mandingo and my mom's side is Fulani, those two clash. And there's a lot of racism between them, and from skin color to the language. And so I grew up in the middle of that. And as a child, I was literally confused which side I was supposed to go to. Was I a full Fulani or was I a full Mandingo? And it brings trauma to a child, not knowing, your place within your own people. These are all African people we're looking at. It's not one European, it's all African people, but we had to live in that. And also being the part of the Fulani, being a little light-skinned girl, that was also a very big problem for me when I go towards the other side. And when I go towards the other side, it was like a big problem that I was not darker skinned. So pretty much you grow up in confusion, but you just learn how to accept yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that perspective. Daduza said that as humans, we tend to mistrust the other. People don't look or behave like our tribe or people. And this is true. Throughout human history, people have always, been afraid of or hated the other. The difference between modern racism and the way ancient people thought about it is that it was based on national identity or tribal identity. It wasn't based on something like skin color and related traits. So in the Roman Empire, for example, they were very prejudiced against what they would call barbarians, non-Romans. Mm. But people from all parts of the Roman Empire, from Britain to the Greece to Egypt and Northern Africa, any citizen was treated the same. And people who looked very different were treated the same because they were citizens. So that's kind of the difference, right, between ethnicity and race, is that race is kind of like something that can't be changed or can't be overcome, whereas ethnicity is membership in a group. So people have always hated the other, but people haven't always been racist in the modern meaning of the term. Your thoughts, Lloyd?
Sorry, I was busy looking up some reference works to on the topic. Sorry, what was the question? Just let me know, please. I was listening, but then I started getting distracted. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so the question, it wasn't really a
Oh,
question so much.
to
It was a
mistrust the other,
reaction
people that
to
look and
that
behave
hit.
like our own tribe. Uh, in reference to what Deduza says, this is actually very true. Humans develop certain practices, certain ideas, we develop social trust, social cohesion based on certain rules of law, certain social behaviors. And within Western countries, we have what's called high trust societies because we all follow certain rules and we don't have to use violence to enforce them. If you look at Islam, those are low trust societies. They trust that women are going to misbehave, that they're going to be promiscuous, and therefore they must use force, they must use intimidation and threats to keep people in line. They have to use harsh punishments. We don't have the same within Western culture, and of course, so there are these differences. So I think the differences between people is generally more towards our moral systems and how we see the world rather than what's in our minds, how we view the world intellectually, socially, morally, rather than necessarily in skin color. If that was the question, then I think this is my answer to that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it
And
wasn't
also,
necessarily an explicit question, but yeah,
yeah, and
reacting to
tribalism is a very primitive way of seeing the world. Tribalism is inherently violent. Coming from Africa, where there are loads of tribal people, the tribes hate each other. Tribalism is inherently a fight over resources and othering others, and it's inherently aggressive. Whereas if you look at the West, this has been largely overcome, but of course, as a way of dividing and creating dissension, distrust, destroying Western culture. And I think it's very clear we have these efforts afoot. Um, they attempt to smear the least racist societies in history, which would be European, Western American culture, as racist, for the simple purpose of trying to destroy those cultures and then taking us back towards tribalism.
your thoughts, Ayo?
Yeah, I think that was both. I think that was well said on both of each other person's parts. And also, when I think about, like, historically speaking in the West, even when you look at like early, like, frontier America, so post 1776, but still so early that much of Manifest Destiny and moving westward, Lewis and Clark, that hadn't really been done yet, or it was just beginning. You hear about all of these different not tribes, but what's the word? Companies, like these companies from the East who would make these expeditions, and they would have, in many cases, good relations with Indians, Native Americans, many who were willing to be cordial and trade with them and establish these sort of partnerships that led to lasting peace. Except at the same time, you also had tribes that were not only hostile toward the Europeans, but hostile toward each other. And so I think that's a perfect example of how you see so much of that at play at once, because undoubtedly there was likely racism, maybe based on physical features, the term like redskins and things like that would go on. But then at the same time, you saw these alliances between Europeans and Native Americans. But then even amongst Native Americans, you saw clashes with their own, where they had animosity toward a certain tribe for being cordial with Europeans or things like that. And so throughout history, especially in the West, early on, you can see how a lot of those different things were at play at once. But as Lloyd said, I think as time has progressed, we've absolutely just become a beacon of that non-prejudice that I think many should aspire to have, right? But that gets flipped on its head, and the opposite ends up being adopted by many people, leading to a lot of unnecessary strife. So I think that was well said.
Thanks.
Very well. Too Many Marys said Muhammad took some non-literal references to lightness and darkness from Gnostic sources and liberalized them. We'll get to Muhammad's words shortly, and then we'll look at later Islamic history. But first, I wanted to have a brief aside here, because the other part of this story about racism in the Americas and Europe is often blamed on Christianity. It's often blamed on Christianity that the Christian conquerors came to the New World and they forced their beliefs on everyone and so on and so forth. But the reality is quite a bit different. It was Christianity that provided really the only check on the slave trade and the desire to subjugate people. Just as an example of this nonsense, Britannica, Encyclopedia Britannica, a beacon of intellectual thought here, and part of their article on the rise of, or the invention of racism, they wrote that Christianity provided an early rationalization for permanent enslavement. Africans were heathens and slaves in their own lands. And to be fair, I'm sure there probably was some Christian who said that. But there's nothing outside of Christianity that would tell you that that is wrong. It was actually the fight. All the people who were against slavery were Christians. They were all arguing that because all human beings have equal value before God, that it's inherently wrong to own another human being. And thus slavery had largely ended in Europe by the time of the exploration of the New Worlds.
Can I mention something, Thaddeus? Earlier,
yes.
there was the Smithsonian is known. I mean, about a year and a half ago, the Smithsonian put out an extremely sort of woke piece of propaganda stating that things like being on time for work or being studious was a very white thing, and it was, and they were passing this off as indications of white supremacy. Right, which just shows where their leaning is. But you mentioned that the word white. Now, the Smithsonian didn't provide the source or the origin of this idea of white. Now, this idea comes out of the 19th century, from the 1800s, from an Enlightenment thinker, a German, called Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. And so he invented the term Caucasian. It came out of nowhere. There was no reason for him to invent this term. And he believed there were 5 races: the Caucasian, the Mongolian, the Malayan, the Ethiopian, and get this, the American. Those are the 5 scientific races, according to this guy. The American. Okay, not the American Indian, the American, who are Europeans, largely.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, we're gonna.
So that's all made up nonsense. I mean, and so they blame, well, this term, but what's the source? Where did it come from? Well, it's the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment thinkers were avowed racists, most of them. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, we're going to see a little bit about this scientific theory. Nothing overlapping or compatible with what you said, but different. So that was actually really good. But ironically, it was the Christian understanding of humans having values that created the necessity to invent this idea of race, because people were greedy, they wanted to make money, and they had to come up with some justification for what they inherently knew was wrong. The chattel slavery system that was basically invented to be used in the New World, which is different than the ancient form of slavery. They had to come up with some sort of justification for that. And what ultimately happened is that the scientists, they jumped in and they saved the day by coming up with these scientific principles why Africans were in fact subhuman, and that they didn't have the same rights as other people because they weren't human. So by the early decades of the 18th century, this is from an article in Time magazine. But the early decades of the 18th century, the continent savants and natural philosophers no longer automatically looked to the Bible to explain the story of human species. Intent on finding physical explanations for natural phenomena, naturalists employed more empirical methods to solve one of the biggest anthropological easy for me to say, questions of the day. Why did people from Africa, millions of whom are already toiling in the European plantations, look different from white Europeans? All the scare quotes are from the original article, because he's saying, this isn't real science and so forth. But at the time, it was absolutely considered legitimate real science. No one said that this was fake. The dominant anthropological concept that emerged around 1750 was called degeneration. Degeneration theory maintained that there was an original superior white race, which was dubbed the Caucasians, and that this group of humans moved about the globe and then began to mutate in the different climates. So originally everyone was white, according to this theory. And as people moved to new climates, they mutated and became, their skin changed color. So thus, you can see how this is different than the evolutionary principle where, people are adapting. It's called degeneration for a reason. It's like they're getting inferior, they're getting corrupted, they're getting messed up. So this was explained as a perversion or deterioration of a higher archetype. Medical practitioners stepped in to flesh out that vague narrative created by these so-called scientists, and they created the basis for what we now call race. Anatomists, in particular, dissected the bodies of supposedly degenerated Africans and published numerous now shocking articles on the supposed damage of living in a tropical climate. Black brains, black bile, black sperm, and even race-specific black lice. In 1851, Samuel Cartwright identified 2 diseases that he associated with the Africans. The first was a mental illness he dubbed drapetomania, which caused slaves to run away. The reason the slaves are running away isn't because, they're abusive owners and whatnot. It's because they have a disease. And they have that disease because of science, because they're degenerated from the natural Caucasian state. The second of the 2 diseases he called Dysesthesia aethpica, a type of Lagarthe that struck Africans who were not enslaved or otherwise overseen by whites. So if you're a slave, you're going to get a disease that makes you want to run away. If you're not a slave, then you're going to be lazy because you have a disease. So thus justifying why they need to be enslaved, and they need to be severely disciplined to prevent them from running away because they have this disease. Naturalists took this one step further, proposing that Africans formed a different species entirely. Predictably, this idea was adopted by members of the pro-slavery lobby in the United States. So as you can see, it's clearly all because of Christianity, or that's what we're told. I'll go to Io for the first reaction.
It's just crazy. I mean, and going back to not the previous slide, but the one before that, one of the first thoughts I had was already you can see how these conflicting secular ideas cause people and intellectual thought to basically step on its toes. So in one breath, they'll say, okay, when we look at geology or anthropology, we know that the cradle of civilization was somewhere in Africa or in that kind of Near Eastern region, right? I think they equate it to like modern day Iran or Iraq or somewhere out there. And so if that were the case, then that type of climate you'd assume, would produce that darker skin tone. Maybe not full on black as in, the sub-Saharan region, but still, more than the kind of tone you get if they were living in the Netherlands or something of that sort, So that's what they say in one breath and say how, this is where it all began. And yet they say that, no, it was actually white. And then people moved to harsher climates. And that's why you see this quote unquote degeneration. Absolutely ridiculous. And then, of course, the second slide, I was actually really surprised when you listed out the dates regarding when these ideas began to emerge, because I know for sure that Darwin, when he came out with The Origin of the Species, which was in the 19th century, somewhere in like the mid 1800s, I believe, he had a lot of these racist views as well. But a lot of people kind of point to that as the kind of first example, since he's the kind of biggest name in that sort of anthropological field. But to hear it go back as far as 1750 was actually really, really interesting. So then it makes more sense, I guess, why his views were not much of a shocker when they began to emerge during the 19th century. So that's what I have to say about it.
Yaya said, what the heck, who wrote this? The KKK? And sadly, this was the intellectual, free-thinking scientists of the day. The well-educated elites are the ones that came up with this crap. This wasn't created out of, lack of education or hatred based on, needing to justify why you're in a poor situation. This was the elites. This was the so-called smart people making this stuff. and it was
A le-
accepted as the best explanation of the way things were at the time.
a lesson for
I just
today as well, too. A lesson for
yes,
today as
Um,
well.
this is disgusting. This is crazy. It's another way again to it's one of the many ways that they literally brainwashed people from Christianity from knowing the true religion by associating it, with racism and whiteness. And as your first slide said that Africans were subhuman, it's it has to be a KKK that wrote this. It has to be. This is outrageous. I'm loss of words. I'll I'll send that to my brother over there, Trans. Lloyd.
Lloyd.
Yeah, a lot to respond to. I'll say so. Haja just mentioned the KKK. It should be noted that the holy book of the KKK is called the Quran, which
You
may be
That's
familiar to
true.
some people. And of
you
course, the
always come at
leader,
the right time.
yeah, so the holy book of the KKK is called the Quran. It might sound familiar to some people. Um, and then also the leader of the KKK is called the Caliph.
Hmm.
So yeah, I've lost your video feed. Well, it's all frozen again for a moment. Okay, so we have the Quran and the Caliph by the KKK. So we have the Quran and the Caliph within the KKK. So, and the KKK burns the cross, which is sacrilege, which is desecration of the cross. So this makes them not Christians. So clearly, and also don't forget the original symbol. If you look at the earliest photographs of the KKK with the original uniform and the original symbol of the KKK is the crescent and the star.
What?
The original the original symbol of the KKK is the crescent and the star before they changed.
Not
So
surprised.
crescent and star, Quran and Caliph. You tell me what that adds up to. And then on the point that you discussed there, Thaddeus, going back to the 1750s, going back to the Enlightenment, to that period, these Enlightenment thinkers, and you call them free thinkers, and that's what they call themselves, and what atheists call themselves today. They derive their ideas from this period and from these prophets of free thinking. You look at Voltaire. Voltaire was an avowed racist. I'm not going to go into detail or at length on the things that he said, but it is a fascinating read to see just what this man thought of black people. Amongst others, he spoke of them as animals with a flat black nose with little or no intelligence. Right, that's one of his comments. Right, and he spoke about Jews. He said they're all of them born with raging fanaticism in their hearts, just as the Germans are born with blonde hair. And he told the Jews, you deserve to be punished, for this is your destiny. Now, of course, where did he get this idea? Well, technically, he would have got this from another one of my favorite characters from the past, a guy called Martin Luther. And then David Hume, very famous philosopher from that period, I'm apt to suspect the Negroes to be naturally inferior to the whites. And then Immanuel Kant called Jews, as one example, a nation of cheaters. And then the Negroes of Africa have not received any intelligence from nature that rises above foolishness. I challenge anyone to suggest even one example, right? Even one example of a Negro who has displayed any talent. This quote goes on at length, but this is the common thought of the Enlightenment thinkers. And this, if you look at America at the time, they went to war over slavery because you had the racist South, who unfortunately these Enlightenment ideas had infected people's minds. And of course, there were economic concerns here. Commercial concerns about, this is how we make our living. So clearly they were looking for justification, and this was wrong. And eventually this led to a fight. So, because within America, you had eventually the dominant view was we hold these truths to be self-evident, that man is entitled to life, liberty, freedom. We're made in the image of God, and this is what won out. This is why they abolished slavery. Final point I'll make on that is that there were three basic verses that Christians and non-Christians, or I would say Christians that have gone against the grain, Christians who have gone off the rails, have used in Genesis 9:18-27, when Noah curses Ham and Ham's son Canaan, and they claim that Ham was black-skinned, but Genesis says nothing of the sort. Ham's skin color is not mentioned. So where they get this, and then of course they link that to Genesis 4:15, where a mark was put on Cain, and so basically you've got this idea that Ham is a slave because Ham's kids would be slaves, and a slave is black. But this connection is entirely arbitrary. So so these ideas unfortunately infected the Christian establishment, but these ideas came out of the Enlightenment. And in fact, you had previously there was just this bigotry or whatever, but then they created, in the Enlightenment, we had the creation of scientific racism. We had scientific atheism, scientific socialism, and of course, scientific Christianity. All of these were invented during the Enlightenment. I
just wanted to make this a brief aside, but I'm encouraging Lloyd to take this up and look more at it, because I saw tons of other material on this. I just didn't want to put a lot of it into the
Yeah, there's a lot of it. I mean, these guys were filthy.
So on that note, Lloyd, why don't you tell us what who you are and what you've been doing on your channel lately?
So let me see. I'm from Africa. I'm like Io. So yeah, I'm from further south. I'm as far south as we can go before next stop, South Pole, sorry. So my channel, I discuss Islamic law. So while I discuss Islam, I go to the what is the legal system of Islam, because Islam claims to have a legal system. It is used in Islamic courts. They're imams, they have judges, they have lawyers, jurists, they write laws, they enforce these laws, they use these laws in their courts. They have legal books, and I go through what those books say. And these books claim to be the final understanding and the final implementation of Islam. And most recently, I have been doing a series of shows with Thaddeus as well on the foundation of modern atheism, which is actually a fairly new, fairly modern socio-political movement, which defined itself as technically scientific Christianity. It was actually an anti-religious movement, in fact, specifically an anti-Christian movement. Found its first success in establishing the very first atheist state in France, the French Revolution, which was an orgy, a bloodbath, and utter irrationality that eventually fell apart. So yeah, atheism always leads to it's a complete poop show whenever it's implemented at government level. And yeah, so this is what I've been doing. Looking at the history of atheism, the history of Islam, and of course Islamic law. So I tackle it from that perspective. This is what I do. And not sure what else I need to add here.
Nope, that's good. Link to Lloyd's channel is in the video description. I know most of you probably already subscribed, but if you're not, get over there and subscribe now. So now, after 15 minutes or so, we're going to actually start talking about Islam. But I did think that background was really important, because these are difficult issues. They're sensitive issues. I don't want to just dive in and say ha, Islam is racist, although that would be an accurate statement. I do want to be fair about this. So I have this slide and I've titled it Islam Invents Stuff. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with or you remember the 1001 Inventions Propaganda Tour.
Yeah.
But basically, it was a claim where they would point to some figure in Islamic history who, had some actual legitimate intellectual contributions to society. In most cases, a couple of them were just pure propaganda. But then they would take this, minor little improvement over existing technology, and they'd elevate it, and they'd say, like, they'd basically imply that so-and-so invented the camera, or so-and-so invented the clock, or in one case in the video, they try to imply that a guy invented an airplane, 300 or 400 years before the Wright brothers. But basically that's the gist of it, is that as they take these legitimate, Muslim thinkers and philosophers and scientists, if you will. I mean, it's really what we now call science. And then they try to elevate their status and make them super important and make it look like they actually invented these things that Europeans invented. Well, my premise here is that in this particular case, maybe Islam actually does deserve the credit for inventing the idea of race and racism. We're going to look at a whole bunch of quotes. And what we're going to see is that in the early period of Islam, the language is ambiguous. It's rather benign. It can be read later on as racist, like racism can be read back into it. It doesn't prevent that, which if it was really the all-knowing words of Allah or whatever, you'd think that it would prevent that. But it wasn't necessarily racist. But then as the empire expanded and they needed to justify their behavior, they quickly became very racist. They weren't just hating people outside the empire, but rather they were specifically targeting people based on their physical characteristics. So we're going to start with the Quran. I'm going to first look at the Quran and then some core Islamic texts, and then I'm going to look at a whole bunch of materials from outside of what we would typically look at to discuss what Islam is about. So the Quran, much like the Bible, it doesn't really have a lot to say about race, which makes perfect sense because people didn't have this concept of race. So there would be no reason for it to speak of it if it's being written by human beings. If it's the literal speech of God, well, maybe it should, but it doesn't seem to directly point out race. Muslims like to point to Surah 30, verse 22, which says, "And of his signs is the creation of the heavens and the earth and the diversity of your languages and your colors. Indeed, in that are signs for those of knowledge." I'm going to pause right here and just get your guys' thoughts on that particular verse. I believe we'll start with Aya this time.
Can we put it back on the screen as well,
Yep,
too?
yep.
Just so I can.
Yep.
Thanks. I mean, yeah, like to me, it seems like a very basic establishment kind of verse, which lays out Allah's kind of, hey, you know, I've created the sun and the moon and the stars. I've created the different languages and colors and things of such. It says, "Indeed, in that are signs for those of." I am interested in that final phrase. Indeed in that are signs for those of knowledge. But other than that, it seems like a pretty standard verse to me.
Yeah, it occurs in the context of a number of other signs. So they're kind of just marveling at the created world, showing all these things. So in this case, it's kind of saying, you know, Allah has, in his wisdom, has created people with differences. Any thoughts from you, Haja?
This is like literally just standard because Allah cannot even make up his mind what he created first, the stars or the earth. So there's that contradiction in the Bible, in the Quran. It's super basic.
Yeah, I would agree. Anything you want to add, Lloyd?
I have mentioned signs for those of knowledge. That word knowledge, we're going to be very careful how that's translated in the Islamic sources. I can't think of the word offhand right now, but very often it refers to, there are about 15 references in the Quran where it utilizes a word that translates as gnosis, secret knowledge. So we could always check if that's one of those times it's used. Yeah, but they speak of secret knowledge above. So there's layers of knowledge, and this is one of the layers above the standard literal plain meaning of the text. It's for those who've got the secret knowledge, who've received that. And this just seems to be taken from it's a plagiarism, or to me a ripoff of the story of Babel. It's just an oversimplification of that. Diversity of your languages. It just seems to be a retelling of it, but a corruption of it.
Yeah, that's a good observation. Actually, it hadn't occurred to me, but that's interesting suggestion, and I think there probably is some merit to that. I would just point out that the verse just says that there are differences. It doesn't say that this is good. It doesn't say it's bad. It doesn't say it's not anti-racist. It's not pro-racist. So for Muslims to point to this as some kind of proof that Islam can't be racism seems to be stretching it quite a bit. plus, what it's doing, it's saying that languages divide you and colors divide you, or at least could be read that way. So it could be read in an explicitly racist context that your languages divide you, your races divide you, your colors, I should say, divide you. But perhaps more to the point, there are other Quran verses that, well, I wouldn't call them racist. They can be read in that light. For example, Surah 3:106, on the day, which means the day of judgment or the day of resurrection, some faces will turn white and some faces will turn black. As for those whose faces turn black, it will be said to them, did you disbelieve after your belief? Then taste the punishment for what you used to reject. But as for those whose faces will turn white, they'll be within the mercy of Allah. They will abide therein eternally. And see also 39:60, which says basically the same thing. And the reason I said I don't think this is racist necessarily is that if you're not thinking in racial terms, then this could be read as neutral. But you can see how a later person coming along would say, yeah, the people who are darker, that's because Allah has cursed them. And the people who are lighter, that's because Allah has blessed them. I'll go around and get your thoughts on this one. And then probably on the rest of them, I'll just get one reaction since we have a lot of them and they're all kind of along the same lines. Haja, your thoughts?
My thoughts on this is racist because it's not the first time in the Quran that they mention this. The white faces, the dark faces, it's not the first time. So what a creator, the God who created us, why do you have to differentiate on color? It's racist. Further verses, maybe you're going to bring it up, but if you don't, I will bring it up because there's more to it than just, saying it's not racist, it's just the color. It makes no sense. I mean, it's either he is very stupid or he's being racist.
Well,
excuse
in
my
Allah's
language.
credit, he definitely can be very stupid. So, yeah, if you want to bring that up, go ahead, and I'll take Lloyd's thoughts next.
Yasir Qadhi responds to this, at least within the Dawah. I've got a Dawah manual called In Defense of Islam, Volume 2, where they discuss this white prophet, because Islam goes out of its way to state that Muhammad was white, as if there's something very, very special about that. And of course, we know from the Sirah that if one calls Muhammad black, that is the death penalty. So it's the death penalty to call Muhammad black. So clearly there's a problem here. Right now, they try to claim now. For instance, Qadhi states that in the Quran, the words tabyadu and muswadda are not in the linguistic forms that are associated with the skin color of humans. Therefore, no Arabic speaker would associate these verses with the descriptions of skin color. Now, whether he's telling the truth or not, who knows? But what's also interesting that within Islam, the word for a black man is abd, and the word for a slave is abd. So they've already pre-associated blacks with slavery. Blacks are slaves by default. So there's evidence going the other way, very hard evidence going the other way. Why is Muhammad always so white? Why is it to call him a black man the death penalty? Why is it considered such an insult? And of course, this idea of whiteness is very, very important within Islam, this purity of skin color. So, and of course, you'll turn white. Now, your face will turn white. Well, that's your skin color turning white. So clearly, this goes against what Yasir Qadhi would say, and what their Dawah manual would say. So clearly, whiteness is associated with goodness, and black with evil at the end of the day, and this is how they will distinguish. And of course, in Mecca, those pillars that were white all turned black. Right. So the Kaaba, from absorbing sin. So if you've got black, you've absorbed a lot of sin. Which, this is, so those are my thoughts.
Your thoughts, Ayo?
Yeah, I'd say that, just looking at this passage in particular, in its kind of own bubble, that I can see why a Muslim would be quick to defend this. at face value, you could just simply say that white and black are simply symbolic for good and evil, because in the same verse, Allah says to the people who are black that they disbelieved after believing. So there's some form of apostate, right? And them being black is just more so a symbolic connection to that rather than having anything to do about race. So I can see why a Muslim would jump toward that. But at the same time, I think what we can say is that, as a kind of offhand sort of way, in a kind of offhand sort of way, this does foster that sort of animosity that could come later toward blacks, and the kind of favorable attitude that one would have toward whites, even if you wouldn't be able to argue that this verse specifically is talking about race. It's very easy to see how it could be used to try and justify racism, not only in the immediate sense, but obviously, I mean, later down the line, if we're talking about it even now. So again, that's just looking at this one verse. I'd be interested to see others, but I can actually see why a Muslim would try to defend this, because to me it seems to be more attached to the fact that they disbelieved after believing, rather than just being inherently white or black.
Yeah, and as we go along, things are going to get harder and harder for them.
Yeah.
So Thaddeus, here I found the hadith. I don't know if you want to put it up on your side. It's Al-Tirmidhi, hadith 38, or I can just read it from here. I can share my screen.
Yeah, I can pull it up, or if you have it already, that'd be great.
I'm using my phone, so I'm not sure. I don't know how to share this screen.
Okay, no problem. I can pull it up. It may come up. Yeah, it'll come. Actually, just hold that thought. We'll have that hadith in a bit. All right. So Mary said, at the least, it means that blackness is there to remind you of eternal punishment. So yeah, I think that's a fair statement. At the very least, there's this association which someone could view as racist, even if it wasn't intended that way originally. And I think that's the most generous thing we could say for the Quran. So this is a quote from Bernard Lewis looking over the evidence of race and slavery and racism throughout Middle Eastern history. And he says, the evidence of the Quran and the lack of racial prejudice in pre-Islamic and the early Islamic times is borne out by such fully authenticated fragments of contemporary literature as survive. I.e., there's no real evidence that people viewed the world in racial terms prior to the coming of Muhammad. We do, however, we do not, however, find any clear indication that this, and he's referring to differences between cultures, was felt in racial terms or went beyond the normal feeling of distinctiveness which all human groups have about themselves in relation to others. So this is the status before the coming of Muhammad. And we're going to see that is going to change after Muhammad. So we're going to start with Ibn Ishaq. I know that Muslims don't consider it an authentic source anymore, but it is written before any of the hadith, so it gives us an earlier picture of Islam. In Ibn Ishaq, there are two poems. Nominally, they're set in the years leading up to the calling of Muhammad, but of course, like all things, reflect more the time the book was written than the actual reality of that time. Southern Arabia at that time period was under the control of Ethiopia. So the Africans living in what is modern day Yemen and southern Saudi Arabia is likely who is being described in these poems. And in this first poem, and remember, these are both nominally set before the coming of Muhammad. I do want to be fair. This is not attributed to Muhammad. This is attributed to some random person. So this guy is praying to Allah, even though they didn't know who Allah was. He says, "Oh God, humiliate al-Wasad bin and Mafsud, who took 100 camels wearing their collars between Hira and Thabir and the deserts. He shut them in what should be pasturing freely and delivering them to the black barbarians. Withdraw from him thine aid, O Lord, for thou art worthy to be praised." And I think for the rest of these, I'm just going to take one reaction, then I'll let the rest of you respond if you like. But rather than have 3 reactions to every single one of these, since there's going to be like 20 to 30 quotes, just to keep things moving along, we'll just do one at a time. So we'll start with you, Io. What do you think about describing the enemies of this guy specifically as the Black Barbarians?
So again, if I wanted to play devil's advocate as a Muslim, I'd say, oh, well, the poem's just being descriptive, right? It's just describing what they look like. But at the same time, when you understand that this poem, or them mentioning the Black Barbarians, is in the context of a poem calling for Allah's judgment upon someone who basically went against, their faction and what they were doing out in this region, it becomes a lot harder to view it a bit more neutrally. And I think that's really the key here. It's calling for God to humiliate this person because of this laundry list of things that they did, including giving these camels that they stole to Black barbarians. So not even just barbarians, but the fact that they were Black, because obviously they didn't have to include that line or that word specifically. So that's where I think, I said the last quote, it could probably be a bit defensible. This one, if you really wanted to stretch it, possibly, but as you said yourself, we're already starting to exit that territory. So
excellent. Hajar or Lloyd, you want to add anything? All right. Next quote, also from Ibn Ishaq, another poem set in the days leading up to the birth of Muhammad. They're talking about getting vengeance against Ibn Yazan, and they're talking about the coming of Warez, which was a Persian ruler who came from the north. So the poem states, Warez bringing the Persians with him. By my life, you were swift in action. What a noble band came out. Never were there like seen among men. Nobles, princes, mighty men's, archers, lions who train their cubs in the jungle. From curved bows they shot arrows, stout as the poles of the howdah, bringing the victim a speedy death. You sent lions against the black dogs. Their fugitives are scattered all over the earth. So, Lloyd, I know you've done some work on the Ethiopian connections to early Islam. I presuming that this line, when it describes black dogs, is talking about the Ethiopians who were in control of the land at the time. What do you think about that?
I mean, it probably is speaking about Ethiopians who at one time were either they were conquered by the Yemenis. And of course, there was a lot of interbreeding there as well. And eventually, at one point, they conquered the Yemenis, and then they conquered a lot of Arabia, Central and Northern Arabia. So calling them black dogs is an insult. It's an outright insult. If this was in the Bible, people would say, oh, the Bible is calling black people dogs. They're calling this particular race dogs. Ethiopians are considered one of, at least historically then, was considered one of the primary races, right? Even within the Enlightenment, it's one of the primary racial groups who were standing for blacks as a group, and they're considered dogs. Now, is this indicative of what was the situation at the time? And where do they get this idea? If this is written for all time within what is supposed to be a holy scripture, I know they say that it's not authentic. Then what is authentic in Islam? Because whatever you show them, it's not authentic, right? It's like show them anything they don't like, and it's not authentic. It's being misinterpreted. It does whatever. So, if this is for all time and this is calling them black dogs, where does it say? Why does it single them out? I mean, it's very negative.
Definitely. Any other thoughts from you, Hajar or Ayo?
So this speedy death. So pretty much they're calling for the killing of darker skinned people. Pretty much. Mm-hmm. This question comes to me it's like, why does Muhammad hate black people so much? And then it goes back to where the black dark Indians did to him. Who knows what happened back there? because the Quran and the Hadith doesn't hide the hatred that they have against black people, to a point even black dogs, you know.
Mm-hmm.
It almost feels like the whole trope about them labeling themselves as lions, training their cubs, and all of that was only used just so that they could then uh, reference them in contrast to dogs, right? So the purpose of building that up and labeling themselves as lions was just so that they could refer to these Ethiopians as black dogs. Very, very interesting. And then you said it was nominally before Muhammad, even though Muslims don't consider it authentic. So I'm not sure where this would really be in relation to the Islamic belief that dogs are forbidden. But I don't want to read too far into it. Those are just my initial thoughts.
Black dogs are forbidden in Islam because a black dog is one of the animals that can break your prayers while you're
Mm-hmm.
praying as a Muslim.
Yeah. So, Haja, you said, why did Muhammad hate black people so much? And Ibn Ishaq might provide us the answer, actually. This might be, if we assume that this story is true, and it doesn't seem like the kind of thing that someone would make up, then this might be the origin of Muhammad's hatred for black people. Christian Gunnut anticipated this as well. This is what could be called a hadith. Ibn Ishaq doesn't follow the later methods of what would be become hadith science, but it is passed on through a chain of narration. He writes, I have heard that it was of him that the apostle said, whoever wants to see Satan, let him take a look at Nabtal ibn al-Harith. He was a sturdy black man with long flowing hair, inflamed eyes, and dark, ruddy cheeks. He used to come and talk with the prophet and listen to him. He would carry what he said to the hypocrites. Nabtal said, Muhammad is all ears. If anyone tells him something, he believes it. Allah sent down concerning him to those who annoy the prophet and say that he is all ears. Good ears for you. And those who annoy the apostle, there is painful punishment. So if we're taking this as a historical event, we have a specific man who happened to be black who was smart and saw that Muhammad was full of crap, that he was just taking stories that people gave him and passing them off as his own personal revelations. And then Muhammad gets pissy about it, and lo and behold, a Quran verse comes down. That's what Ibn Ishaq is telling us. I mean, seems pretty clear to me. And how does Muhammad, or at least the word put on Muhammad, describe him? He says, if you want to see Satan, look at that guy. That black guy right there. That's what Satan looks like. Now, originally, he probably really just hated that particular guy. But he probably, it's plausible that in his mind, he started associating all black people with that one particular person he really hated.
Very good point.
Since you already started to speak, we'll go to you, Io.
No, yeah, I think that's a good point. Because again, it lists other things in the description, about the long flowing hair, inflamed eyes, dark ruddy cheeks, etc. So I like your perspective on it. That maybe it just kind of started off as something that was a bit more generalized, because this guy was like a fly in his soup, that he couldn't seem to get rid of. But as we see, not just from statements like this, but Islamic practices and things that came later down the line, it would make total sense why. I mean, because if there's one thing about Muhammad, is that he seemed to be very insecure about a lot of things. Killing people that made critical poems of him and things of that sort. And so, if this man Nabtal was as annoying and as much of a burden for Muhammad as this passage makes it out to be, then I can see why his attitude toward black people would be this way, right? Because he basically be associating them with this person who caused others to doubt his own prophethood and to doubt his what he thought was his standing before God. So I like that. I think that's very interesting to think about.
Any other thoughts?
Interestingly, I just got a comment from a Muslim woman on one of the videos I posted on Al Fadi's channel, and she just said to me that I am half white, or she would say, I am gray. And she says, all problems originated from black people. Thus, only black people can fix the root of their problems. She just said that a few minutes ago. So, I mean, I'm not saying she's necessarily speaking for Islam, but that's a very interesting statement to make. All problems originate from black people. I mean, what a coincidence that I
Yeah,
get
I
this
mean, very coincidental there. I mean,
get
we're just
this
looking at
response.
Muhammad blaming his problems on a particular black man, and you get that comment showing how these same attitudes are prevalent even today.
And it saddens me is a woman.
Yes,
I would like
it's a
expect
woman.
that comment from a from a Muslim guy, but from a woman, that's a low blow.
You know, I suspect that the Dawa guys are getting tired. I think they're getting run into the ground, especially lately. They are overworked, and I don't think they're coping. And I'm finding more women are starting to do Dawa, and I think they're trying to earn the respect of men. And I'll say this bluntly: everyone knows Alonzo Harris. Alonzo Harris is a female, right? There's another one called 0786AH8. That's a female. I have been calling them females for months now, and they have never denied it. So you're seeing more and more because Alonso has never denied being female. I've got more than one person calling them she and her and never denied it. And the other one has never, for a few weeks now, and it's never been denied. So you see more of this. And it's very sad, especially when you look at the treatment of women. It's really sad.
It really saddens me when I see like Muslim women really defending Islam. But then I look at myself when I was a Muslim, it's just the ignorance. Like, it's the majority of them never reads the Quran or the Hadith. So that's how I was when I was a Muslim. So you're just a walking dummy, you know.
I'm just, you made me think, isn't Satan black as well?
Mm-hmm.
Because whoever wants to see Satan, let him take a look at Nabtal. He was a sturdy black man. I believe Satan is also black in Islam. So the symbolism, Satan is actually black. In Christianity, Satan appears as white, right? A being of light. Whereas in Islam, it's a black guy. No, well, why is this being associated with blackness, with a black man?
Lord,
Because that is definitely a skin color association. It is not simply an association with the color. It's association with the race of black people.
yeah, I'm trying to find this hadith of what a group of Indian men did to Prophet Muhammad in the back. So I am trying to find that hadith because I think that is part of the hatred here.
That would have been erased from all these websites
I
because all
tried
those are
finding it.
disappearing.
I
Now,
literally had it, but I cannot find it.
the embarrassing ones are disappearing. They're being deleted all the
Ah,
time. Adam
this.
Seeker's the guy to go to for that one. He'll know it.
I'm like upset at myself. I should have screenshot it and just save it.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, the white obsession in the Islamic world is crazy. I don't
Well,
understand it.
if you look at the Islamic slave trade, they took black slaves as laborers, and then they raided Ireland, England, Italy, went as far as Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, to get white blonde women as sex slaves. They specifically wanted white women.
Yeah.
So clearly there's a preference for a certain. I mean, people talk about the Atlantic slave trade took 300,000 black people to North America. Well, what about the Mediterranean slave trade, where Muslim slavers took at least 1.5 million, mostly white women, to Muslim
Yeah.
lands as sex slaves?
And it's still going on today.
Oh
It's
yeah,
still going on today
yeah.
in
Yeah,
Saudi, in Dubai.
we'll see some data on slavery later, but Lloyd is absolutely correct. There is actually a substantial difference between the transatlantic slave trade and the Islamic slave trade, and that's for the Europeans is primarily about a cheap source of labor. For the Muslim world, it's primarily sex slaves. They were primarily after sex slaves as opposed to laborers. Daduza raised an interesting suggestion. He says, was maybe Mo mistreated while he was in Ethiopia? Because, of course, there's the tradition that Muhammad and his companions fled to Ethiopia when they were being persecuted and spent a couple years there. Anyone want to give some thoughts on that suggestion?
I personally wouldn't know, but I think it kind of goes back to what I said earlier about if he was, it would certainly explain a lot given his personality and his nature. I think the point of it more so is not really where he went, but the attitude he would have had regardless of where he was, to be vengeful towards whoever would have tried to insult him, attack him, whoever it may have been. I mean, because even once he went back after being persecuted, he took vengeance there. So that wasn't none of that is anything that's too far of a cry to imagine for someone like Muhammad, with an entire army behind him, especially.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, it would have to be speculative. We can't know what happened to Muhammad in Ethiopia, but it's a reasonable guess that that could be part of the reason that this hatred arose. So we're now going to turn to some of the hadith. We just looked at a passage from Ibn Ashaq that equated Satan with a particular black man. And if my mouse starts working again, it froze up for a second there. We'll see that there is a hadith that says something similar. So basically, it's long here, so I'm not going to read the whole thing. But basically, Aisha is, she hears a noise. She hears a scream and the sound of children. And they go and they look what's going on. And it turns out that it's an Ethiopian woman who is, dancing or something along those lines and playing with the children. And Muhammad asks Aisha if she wants to keep watching, and basically she says yes. And then Umar shows up, and the woman and her children disappear. And Muhammad responds, I see the shaitan among men, and jinn have run from Umar. So it seems, at least to me, to be equating this Ethiopian woman with shaitan or Satan. Your thoughts, Haja? You're muted.
Sorry. I'm going to pass that to someone else until I take a look at this.
Sure. Lloyd, your thoughts?
I see the shaitan among men and jinn have run from Umar. Yeah, the way this is written, one has to wonder, have they changed the language of this to soften the language? So the shaitan among men and jinn. So he's calling her a shaitan, a Satan. He's calling her a Satan. So for what reason? It was an Ethiopian woman prancing around while the children played around her. So for what reason is he calling her? Then Umar appeared. She said, so they dispersed. So,
and for what reason was he even watching her kind of transfully with Aisha in the beginning? That's what.
And
really...
why is he calling her a Satan? Well, for what reason? I mean, there's no context to this. This Correct. Is really interesting. I mean, what conclusion do you draw? Except, okay, he's accusing her of being a Satan, a demon. Exactly. And we have this earlier already with Satan is black, and so these associations now continue.
Yeah, she's pretty much a Satan for being black.
Yeah, we're going to see Mo had some other interesting thoughts about Ethiopian women as well. We'll get to those in a second.
Oh boy.
Andrew said, apparently that shaitan means anyone who annoys Muhammad. Anyone who annoys Muhammad is a Satan. And he does seem to throw that around pretty liberally. So we'll go ahead and take a look at the next slide here, which is Muhammad was not black. So we all know these many hadith, and I only put 4 of them. There's probably at least 20 of them that talk about how white Muhammad was. Some of them, someone's just asking, comes along and they ask, where's Muhammad? They say, oh, it's that white guy over there. So apparently he was, at least according to the hadith, keep in mind these could be ideas projected back on Muhammad. They could reflect a later bias, but they just seem to say that he's so white that that's who you can identify. They talk about his white complexion.
I should
The
mention,
whiteness of his armpits.
There's the story in the Sirah where Muhammad is cut open. There's multiple variations of it, but he's sliced open as a child. People witnessed 2 angels come to him, cut him open from chin to belly button, and they take out his heart and they wash his heart and they remove something black, a black pit from his heart, which is removing the evil, they remove the shaitan from him, and they leave him with nothing but whiteness. They fill it with white ice or white snow afterwards. Mm-hmm. So there's this association, black with evil, again, within the Islamic sources.
Yeah, definitely. My personal favorite is the whiteness of his armpits, because apparently people were staring at Muhammad's armpits and seeing how white they were. But pretty much every aspect of his body is described as white in one hadith or another. What do you think about all these hadith that call Muhammad white, Ayo?
I mean, yeah, I think it's very interesting because whether it's something that was literal and physical about him or something that was just projected later, I think after coming this far with the different quotes and sources that we've looked at, there's no doubt been this distinction created between evil and good and white and black that we see within the Quran, the Hadith, the Sirah, that makes sense when we see how it's applied to Muhammad now, right? Because if this whole track record has shown that we've labeled black as being evil, black as being negative, something that's associated with Satan, then when we finally get to looking at Muhammad, it would seem completely counterintuitive to see him as someone anything but white, anything but having that pure complexion. But it just shows the differences in the worldviews for sure, because going off of what Lloyd said earlier about how in Christianity, Satan's described as that angel of light, with that overall brightness. It's just interesting how that variation is seen here, where it's the other way around, and the white is usually associated with the good here. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know for sure, but it'd be interesting to think about for sure.
Yeah, Villainous points out that no one talks about Jesus' skin color in the Bible, or really the skin color of any other character. Like maybe once or twice someone talks about themselves and identifying their dark skin, which would just be a sign that they're a laborer. They spend a lot of time outside in the sun. It wouldn't have any racial connotation. But yeah, we don't get a physical description of Jesus, almost like his physical description is irrelevant. But with Muhammad, you could just look at these and say, okay, Muhammad was coincidentally very light skinned, so people pointed that out so everyone would know who he is. However, this other famous hadith really undermines that defense. Ahmed ibn Abi Suleiman, the companion of Sanan, said, anyone who says that the prophet was black should be killed. The prophet was not black. Lloyd, you're the expert on Sharia. Why would someone be killed for saying Muhammad is black? What law does that relate to?
You're not allowed to insult Muhammad. So within the Reliance, it's section P75.2, but it's called Sab al-Rasul. So insulting the prophet. So anything that brings dishonor or anything that paints Muhammad as less than absolutely perfect is illegal in Islam. So clearly associating him with being black means that he's not perfect. So black is imperfect and white is perfect. And this is now the death penalty. So this is the reason. So Muhammad has to be seen as perfect. Anything less than that, and you are guilty of apostasy, and you can be killed for that.
Haja, how does it make you feel to know that calling Muhammad black would be considered an insult?
Honestly, I excuse my language, but I feel like an idiot for, being a Muslim, all my life. And another thing that also upset me is the fact that why is Africa still following Islam? Because this is definitely not for Black people. I mean, they don't even hide it. The whiteness of his legs, the whiteness of his armpit. It's just like, and growing up, we just think Muhammad is the one who's in favor of Black people, and Jesus is the white one. And it makes me sick, and it just makes me more zealous to spread out the truth and just literally show people that the only white person here, head to toe, ginger, is Muhammad.
Yeah. Yeah, well put. I have nothing to add to that. We'll go ahead and move on to the next hadith, which is the black stone. Ibn Abbas narrated that the Messenger of Allah said, "The black stone descended from paradise, and it was more white than milk. Then it was blackened by the sins of the children of Adam." I think someone mentioned this earlier, but I forgot who, so I'm just going to go to Io. How does it make you feel to have black color associated with sinfulness?
I think, you know what, honestly, I think on its own, it doesn't bother me that much, just because I think when we think about like being in the dark, right, being alone in the dark, there's kind of that fear that's associated with it. There's kind of that evil, dreadful feeling that's associated with it. So that on its own in a bubble wouldn't really bother me. But obviously that's not the context of Islam. Within the context of Islam, we not only see, evil being equated with this color black, but it also being equated with Black people, and people or regions where Black people reside, like in Ethiopia. And so this passage in and of itself really, to me, doesn't say much that I can really draw from it. But that's only because this is this passage in and of itself, right? But when I think about the context of Islam as a whole, I can't help but think that, especially when you look at like the black stone and the way in which Muslims worship it and revere it and will claw each other tooth and nail just to be able to get close to it, and then hearing how it's blackened by the sins of the children of Adam, and knowing all the previous things that we've looked at, it's hard to see how this wouldn't, at least in sort of offhand, indirect way, continue to deepen that subconscious animosity toward Black people, or toward just Blackness in general.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good way to put it, because I think that it wasn't just like, Muhammad was really racist and then everyone was magically racist after it. I think that was a process, and people looking at these things, and over time, maybe originally they didn't have that association, but you could see how when later Muslims are talking about how evil Black people are, they might have this kind of thing in mind. You wanted to say something, Lloyd?
What's interesting, if you look at the shows I did on Jay Smith's channel, as well as the ones recently on Al-Fadi, inevitably, all of the Islamic Dawagandists start to call me racist names. I've been called at some point, and they just started doing it now. I mean, they've just started to call me an Uncle Tom, or they start to say, "Oh, you're black and you're stupid. You are," So they're like, so they will inevitably turn towards racist slurs. I've been called a monkey by Islamic apologists. I've been called, the typical slew of American pejoratives that are used in that sense. I've been called, I'll use the term here, nogger, just replace one of the letters there, so I've been called all of these things. And if Muslims are so anti-racist, and so, I don't know, not to be, well, if this is against their beliefs, why is it that inevitably they will all turn around and find the most pejoratively racist terms to use against me? Because this seems to be standard practice. I think this is common on YouTube. I don't think this is actually an aberration. It's quite normal. So this tells us that there's an issue here.
Yeah, I would agree. Built for Speed asked me if we've discussed the curse of Ham.
We mentioned that earlier.
Yeah, it came up briefly. I wasn't going to actually go through it because it's not
Genesis
really...
9:18-27, Noah curses his son Ham and Ham's son Canaan, decreeing their slavery to Ham's brothers. And of course, Christian racists, and this came out of the Enlightenment, I'll just be brief, that is, they made the connection Ham equals slave equals black, even though the Bible makes no mention of Ham's color. And then these racists conflated this passage with Genesis 4:15, where the mark put on Cain by the Lord was believed, and again without any evidence to be black skin. So the mark put on Cain was supposed to be he was made to have black skin, where there's no evidence for that. So I would think it's very probable that this was a propaganda campaign by groups such as the KKK or something to try to deliberately distort Christian teaching, and eventually, unfortunately, it got adopted by people, and it's tainted the history of Christianity ever since.
Yeah, I wasn't going to actually talk about this in the presentation, but I did see that Al-Tabri explicitly makes this connection as well. That he says that the descendants of Ham are the black people. So it is found in the
Wow,
tafsir.
I did not know that.
Yep.
That comes
It is
from
found
Tabari.
in Islamic thought, but I wasn't going to bring it up.
Grief, so it probably, I wonder if it came from the KKK, then they would have got it from the Muslims. Good grief, I did not know that.
All right, we'll go ahead and move on to the next hadith here. And this is the one that Haja was talking about earlier. I quoted a different version of it, but I put C also, Al-Tirmidhi, number 38. So they're basically the same, just slight wording difference. So-and-so reported God's messenger as saying, God created Adam when he created him and struck his right shoulder and brought forth his offspring like white ants. Offspring white, like small ants, or the other version says like seeds. And he struck his left shoulder and brought forth his offspring black as though they were charcoal. Then he said to the party on the right side, to paradise, and I do not care. And he said to the party in his left shoulder, to hell, and I do not care. Certainly seems to me that this is an explicit statement that from Adam came two groups of people, one destined for paradise for no particular reason other than Allah's decree, and the other destined to hell for no particular reason other than Allah's decree. And those two groups are described as white and black. Now, there's a comment earlier, probably with this hadith in mind, which I was saved from David, and Allah don't mind. Man, that's too bad, because Yahweh does.
Amen. Yeah,
Do you want to comment?
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Ayel.
I was just going to say, and when comparing this to me, I was reminded of the first passage we looked at. When it talks about the people who turn white versus turn black. At least in that first passage, as I said, it was tied to some sort of the color, white and black, was tied to some sort of behavior, specifically black being referred to or equated to those who disbelieved after believing, so some form of apostate. But here we see no mention of that. We see no mention of they did X, Y, and Z. Here's why I'm condemning them. Here's the justification for it. It's just nope. As you said, from Adam, we see two groups of people, or at least two groups of people that are listed. One is destined for paradise, and one is destined for hell. And there's no justification. There's no rationalization. It's just sheer preference on behalf of Allah. And there's not much justification or pushing or anything I can do here to really make it seem otherwise.
Hajj, I know you wanted to talk about this hadith, so I'd like to get your comments.
Like Ayo was saying, that it's this, the racism in Islam literally began with Allah. This is Allah, the creator, their creator, who is saying these things. So actually not Allah, aka Muhammad, because it's a made up character, I think. You know, it's just obvious. Like, I don't have much to say about it. You know, so black people, someone with, you know, a black skin color is condemned to hell. So if you're a Muslim out there and you pray 5 times a day, you do everything, and you're black, you're still going to hell. So according to the Quran and according to the Hadith, so why stay? What do you have to lose?
Yeah.
But you know, the crazy part is not all Muslims, Middle Easterns, Arabian are light skinned. There's a lot of dark skinned people over there. So in what degree of darkness are they talking about?
Yeah, good question.
That's
Because
true.
they're
Like
pretty brown.
where does it start and end?
Yeah, they're pretty brown. So where does it start and where does it end?
Notice also the association here that the black offspring, nominally it's describing their color, but it calls them charcoal. Like their only purpose is to burn. Allah creates them just to burn them. And in the Termidi version, the white race is described as seeds, that they're fruitful and they're productive. They bring growth. The black are for the fire, the white are for bringing growth and good things upon the earth, according to this hadith. Go ahead and move on. Now we get some amazing, totally not at all racist descriptions of black people in the Sahih Hadith. Of course, we know this one well. The Prophet said, "Listen and obey to your chief, even if he's an Ethiopian whose head is like a raisin." We can compare this to similar hadith where someone says, "The Prophet advised me to listen to the man in position and authority and obey him, even if he were a slave, maimed and disabled." And then a third version, "Obey whoever has put it in authority over you, even if he is a cropped-nosed Ethiopian slave." So nominally, it's saying obey your leader no matter what. But it's creating the picture of the most ridiculous, inferior leader imaginable. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense. And in all cases, it seems to be a disfigured black person. Your thoughts, Lloyd?
I'm actually just looking up a hadith. Hold on. I had it. There's actually a story. Okay, hold on here. There's another one that you may have missed, which says, they speak of and told me to listen and obey, even if the leader was an Ethiopian slave with amputated limbs. I don't know if you've seen that one. So even if he was an Ethiopian, okay, no, maimed and disabled.
Yeah, I mean, similar idea. Yeah.
The correct one is with amputated limbs, which means that they've obviously amputated the limbs of the slave according to the Sharia. So yeah, they seem to treat them as a lesser being. Remember, abd is what they use for a black person in Islam. Abd also means slave. So by being black, you're automatically on the level of a slave. You're assumed to be a slave. So this is the status of black people. And in fact, there are still black slaves. Like executioners are often black slaves in Saudi Arabia. So they are very low status. They are outcasts from society, and this position is given to a black slave. So they have this caste system. So these blacks are considered of a lower status, a lower caste. And I think this is I think it's clear we're seeing that this is not something that has a high regard for black people, Africans.
I'm going to go ahead and read this other hadith along different context, but similar idea of describing a black person as very disgusting and maimed. The most hateful among the creation of Allah is one particular black man among them, referring to a particular tribe that this hadith is about. One of his hands is like the teat of a goat or the nipple of a breast. And then they conquer this group and they kill all of them, but they specifically seek out this guy's body and they eventually find it. Your thoughts, Io, on these set of hadith here, which describe the physical characteristics of, in theory, a particular black person, but kind of hard not to see this as a racist connotation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the first few passages more so than the latter, just because of what you said, which I really liked, which is that okay, it's trying to give this command. I mean, because if it's trying to just give a basic command of respect and be subservient to whoever is put over you, like obey the authorities. I mean, there are passages in the Bible that talk about that, right? But it doesn't view the length or the extremity to which you obey that command through the lens of race, like it does within Islam, because they could have. I mean, they didn't have to even put any sort of example, right? They could have just said obey whoever is over you, right? And that could have just been the end of it. But they don't do that. They go further and they say, here's how much so that should be the case. That even if it were a black man, even if it were an Ethiopian who had a raisin head or had amputated limbs or whatever else they go on to say, that to me, as you said, really shows how they viewed Ethiopians, how they viewed people with who were maimed, who had those amputated limbs. And so by bringing those up as examples, what they're basically saying is that, yeah, they're at the bottom of the barrel of that society. And so it's kind of like one of those backhanded compliments, where you say something good, but you have to do something or say something bad in order to basically get it to land on its feet. So okay, be obedient to whoever's over you. I guess that's good, but are we really just going to adopt this idea that Ethiopians are less than? Because if that's the case, then the command as a whole just seems to be kind of in vain, If you're kind of in vain if you're gonna obey someone but not have the right attitude toward them, if that makes sense.
Any other thoughts? All right. So now we have this hadith where an Ethiopian is made to say to the prophet, "You Arabs excel us in all, in build, in color, and in the possession of the prophet." And then he asks the prophet if he can still be saved. And mercifully, Muhammad tells him that, yes, in paradise, you will be turned white and you'll see, and your whiteness will be seen for the stretch of 1,000
Wow.
years.
Oh man, that's pretty blatant. Good grief.
Oh my goodness.
That's in your face.
Basically saying you've got to change in order to make it in, or you have to be changed. It's incredible. And he probably only told him that because of his flattering of him in the beginning, saying that you excel us in all. But I mean, based off of how we talked about black people in prior passages, I don't even think he'd say this just to anyone. Again, it goes back to that attitude, that self-esteem and that insecurity. And so, he butters him up a bit, tells him these good things, especially how the Arabs possess the prophet of all people. Oh, okay, well now you've made it into my good graces. So I'll show you a bit of reprieve here and tell you that you can make it in, but you've got to be white. It's just really crazy when you think about it.
Any other thoughts on this one?
I mean, this says it right there.
Yeah.
And
I mean, this is in your face.
Yeah.
And they're saying, oh, you Arabs are greater than us. You Arabs are amazing. We worship you. You excel us all in build and in color. But yeah, one day you can be white like me.
What? And then I look at Arabs and I look at the word Arab, the people of the desert. And I look at Africa, a land where you can pretty much grow anything to live. It's just so backwards. This man, this Muhammad, this man. I am I literally think this man is he hated what God created him to be. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a problem there. This is not just craziness. I feel like this is a person that hates himself and want to be something else. Just like in his verses when he talks about the paradise, is things that you see a 7th century Arabian man would want at that point. He talks about honey, he talks about couches. You know what I mean? It's things that he wanted.
Yeah.
So this man wants to be pure white, like the Romans. So he's proud of his lightness. Then everything after that is beneath him. Oh,
Well
how
put.
I wish he was still living in these centuries. Oh gosh. All
So
right.
we have a complete and total refutation. Sorry, did you want to say something about this, Hadith? No, okay, good. We have a complete and total refutation from Agha Abbas. He says, he's quoting from Sahih Muslim here. Abu Hurairah reported Allah's messenger as saying, "Verily, Allah does not look at your faces and your wealth, but he looks at your hearts and deeds." So we've been defeated. All of these sources are now irrelevant because there is a Sahih narration that says Allah doesn't look at your faces. I want to get all your reaction here. See what do you think of this defense? We'll start with Ayo.
Well, my first request is obviously going to be what's the context, because um, Allah often Allah often distinguishes between Muslims and non-Muslims, and has a kind of caste system where He has one group on a pedestal versus another. And so it's really going to come down to who He's referring to, what the context is, even in terms of the time period and what was going on. But even without knowing that, when you look at all of the sources that we just looked at, something's got to be squared here, right? It could just be the fact that it's a simple contradiction. I mean, that we can't put that past Allah, right? We can't just put it past Him that it's a simple contradiction. But even if it's not, it makes it very hard to square when you consider all of the passages that we just looked at. And it also says nothing about Muhammad's own behavior, right? Because that's the really important point here. It doesn't really matter what's even being said in this verse when you think about the fact that Muhammad himself is supposed to be the best example for mankind. And we just went through all the passages over what he thought and what he did and how he treated. So even if this is what Allah's attitude truly is towards all races, He can't truly be God then, because His judgment's terrible by choosing someone who He knows is an inherent racist, who calls Ethiopians raisin heads and considers them the lowest of society, to basically say, hey, here's my best example, here's who you should emulate. So either way, it's a mess across the board that can't really be squared one way or another.
Your thoughts, Haja?
I said it right. Not comment, that is.
Very good. Lloyd?
How do we know this hadith is not abrogated? Because hadith are abrogated just like Quranic verses. How do we know it hasn't been abrogated by another hadith or another verse of the Quran that came later?
There you go.
We don't know that. Two, he's not allowed to, first of all, Islamic law allows him to lie. So it is legal for him to tell lies. In fact, he gets rewarded for it. And then also, he's not allowed to have knowledge beyond he's not allowed to engage in discussions of the Sharia. So there's a lot of other things that go in here. Don't forget, Islam considers itself, once you become a Muslim, they consider themselves to be the master race, the new chosen ones. Everyone else who is not a Muslim is considered to be the K word. The K word is someone that you can subjugate by using force. You can enslave. You can use them as sexual slaves. You can kill them with impunity. You have to dominate them. You have to force them to obey the will of Allah, the rules of Islam, the Sharia, despite whatever else, other protestations he might make here. So, and also Allah looks to your faces and your wealth, but looks to your heart and to your deeds. Well, this only applies to Muslims. Again, Allah's laws only apply to Muslims. So there's a different set of rules because people speak of apartheid, but I mean, I should know. I grew up under apartheid, right? That political system in Islam has a two-tiered political system. In fact, it's three. It's men and women within Islam also have different tiers, and then of course you get everyone else, and then of course we've seen blacks at a much lower rung. I don't see how one hadith fixes dozens and dozens of negative citations. I don't see how one hadith somehow fixes. And also, again, this could be abrogated. We would have to go into the doctrine that says how have Muslims treated historically black people? How have they treated others? So no, this is not a valid answer. Just having a look at, oh, here's a nice thing. Well, because I can go to the Bible and say, here, the Bible says something nice, so that cancels out everything that blah blah blah. That's what they do. So yeah, this is not a valid answer.
Someone asked him what the tafsir on the hadith tell him about that particular hadith, and he either is actually ignorant
So the
or
tafsir on the
ignorant.
tafsir on the hadith are there's almost nothing available to us. These are strictly the domain of the scholars. There's very, very little available to anyone because the scholars don't read the hadith themselves. They go to the tafsir of the hadith. The major work being that of Asqalani, and this is almost none of these have been translated because the hadiths come without any context, and for this you need to have a lot of additional material. That's where the seerah comes in to provide all of this additional material. Then you've got other things like so he's not allowed to speak to us about this because that would be treason. He would be revealing secrets and weaknesses of Islam. He would making Islam, well, he'd be presenting a weakness which can be used to attack Islam. He's not allowed to do that. And yes, we know what we're talking about. Aga Abbas, you do not. I happen to know this better than you do. And I will note that, I mean, over the last, how long do I know you now, Thaddeus? 3-4 years?
Yeah. Somewhere around 3 years, probably.
Yeah, I've invited all of these Muslim commenters, right? I mean, if you guys go through my comments, you go through our Fadi or Jay Smith's channel, I've invited almost literally every single troll Muslim commenter. Like, just about literally every single one. I said, look, let's meet in a live stream. Let's go through the books of the madhabs. Let's open up the Sharia. Let's go to the fiqh books, right? Let's read them. Let's see what they say. Okay, you say I'm wrong. You say you know better. Come on the stream, educate us. We'll read the laws, we'll read the books, and we'll see what they say. Not one in 3 years is accepted. The only person was, what was his face, Safraz, and he came on accidentally, unprepared, right? And everyone else has refused, flat out refused. If I'm wrong, and these guys are so smart, why aren't you able to go to the tafsir? Go to the Sharia, open the books, the legal books of Islam, and just show me how I'm wrong. So yeah, I'm not willing to believe these guys. I mean, they want you to stick with the Quran and waste your time.
Yeah, I was just going to say he's either feigning ignorant or is actually ignorant because he's implying that there is no such thing as tafsir on hadith, which is
Asqalani. Look it up. Asqalani. Okay. So,
and a couple of people pointed out that he had the wrong reference because that's not what Sahih Muslim 2564 says. I think that is a real hadith. I think he just had the wrong reference, to be fair. And now he wants me to read Quran 49:13. I will go ahead and pull that up, but I'll do so while you guys are discussing the next slide so that there is not dead space here.
Yeah. So I was referring, by the way, to the Fath al-Bari, The Victory of the Creator, the Fath al-Bari, by Imam Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, who is considered the greatest commenter on Sahih Bukhari. And they are commentaries on all of the hadith which expand upon them and explain them. Just like they are tafsirs of Islamic verses, they are tafsirs of all the hadiths.
So this is so I did bring up 49:13 while you were saying that. O Muhammad, we have created you from a male and a female and made you into nations and tribes that you may know one another. Verily, the most honorable with Allah is that who was at Taqwaq. Verily, Allah is all-knowing, all-wise. Very similar to the verse of the Quran I read at the start of this. It doesn't say anything about equality. It just says that Allah created people in all different tribes and whatnot. It doesn't even mention race. So pretty weak attempt there. Abbas. But let's go ahead and look at this next slide now, which is the bad omens that Black people bring. So the prophet said, I saw, and the translator had to add in a dream. This may or may not actually be a dream. He may have actually just literally saw a black woman, but the translator says it's in a dream. A black woman with unkempt hair going out of Medina and settling in Mahia. I interpreted that as a symbol of epidemic, of Medina being transferred. So he either actually literally sees a black woman or he has a dream about a black woman. If I had a dream about a person, I would not interpret that as a sign of coming disease. But Muhammad, he has a dream or sees a black woman and he says, yep, I know what's going to happen. Their city is going to be diseased. Your thoughts on that one, Haja?
Like you said, I don't think this was a dream. I think this was real. I think he actually saw a black woman.
In which case, he probably would have assumed that she was carrying disease and he wouldn't have needed any special insight to know that this was a sign of a coming epidemic.
I think the part where he added that carrying disease or epidemic, I think that is just Muhammad's way of painting the black skin, black people as, as the lowest.
Did Muhammad have any black wives?
This look made up. Like, it's just almost like it's made up, It's just like, hey, I just have to, write more verses to fill my Quran or something. It doesn't sound like, first of all, a dream that someone would have. A symbol of epidemic. Wow. That's unkept hair. What does he mean about unkept hair?
Did Muhammad have any black wives? I'm just curious, and the answer to that is no. If there were so many black people in that area at the time, why did Muhammad, he had something like 22 wives over the span of his career as a prophet. Why did he not have a black wife? Why did he only choose non-black women?
Because he literally have hatred for black skin.
Yeah.
He literally does. It's there's no other explanation of this.
Yeah, I should get going in a moment because it's 1 o'clock in the morning here, and
sorry. There's like one or two more on Hadith, and then we can call it an end there, I suppose, and do a part 2.
No, Allah doesn't care for their deeds. Allah cares for the intentions. As long as your intention is good, doesn't matter if your deed is immoral, if your deed is evil. This is not true. As long as your intention was good, if you wanted to murder someone because they insulted Muhammad, but you didn't manage to kill him, but you only stabbed him in the eye, for instance, and blinded him, well, this is good. You've just done good for Allah. So no. This is your opinion. This is Aga Abbas's opinion. It would be nice if he would actually come with some Islamic law to prove it from the words of the scholars. You always say to us, have you consulted a scholar? Well, how about you bring us the words of an actual scholar so that we can see what the scholars say within the Islamic law? How do they interpret that within the ijma? So bring me something from the ijma. Otherwise, we're not interested in your opinion because we know it's false.
And I would just point out that this in no way undermines any racism. All I'd have to say is, yep, black people are inherently not righteous, and this verse is still true. So he's trying to tell us that it means Islam is not racist, but that is a bad assumption on his part, or a bad logical conclusion. Like I said, we got a couple more on the Hadith, and then we'll end it there, and we'll do a part 2 on after Muhammad. So the first part 1 will be the racism of Muhammad, then part 2 will be racism after Muhammad. The prophet said, if I were looking at him, a black person with thin legs, plucking the stones of the Kaaba one after another. So he's describing the destruction of the Kaaba in the last days. And he says it's going to be a black person with thin legs. Any thoughts on that one, Io?
Yeah, at first I was reading it ahead of time, trying to make sense of it. I'm like, why is this a bad passage? But after what you said, I see now he's basically destroying the Kaaba. Um, Again, we just see that the equation with the black person being evil. I'm not sure what the deal is with them having thin legs, but
Yeah.
again, yeah. Either way, the whole picture that it creates is. I mean, this is literally basically saying that a black person is going to take down one of their holiest, sites. I mean, how do you walk away from that and then have this sort of positive, neutral, at least neutral view of black people? Right? You just don't. And so, as I said, these passages, if like you said, you were right, Thaddeus, they've only gotten more and more explicit and undeniable. And to go as far as saying that someone, I mean, it's pretty far and extreme saying that Satan himself is a black man, but especially with Muslims revering their alleged holy sites so much, to say that a black person is going to be the one that destroys it is, I mean, that's really something. And so I don't know how you walk away with that, how you walk away from that, and really be surprised with the Arab slave trade and all of the things that we see in history as a result in Islamic attitude and Muslim attitude toward black people. It's crazy.
Aya, you can look at it like this, though. If they say a black person would do that, it may be just a prophecy that's about to come once, black people actually finds out the racism in Islam,
Yeah.
will actually go and destroy that thing, literally destroy it and bring it down. There's nothing in there but little stones.
Yeah.
That might be
Wait.
the one prophecy that's going to come to pass.
We have one more along the same lines or the same theme. A husband and wife are fighting basically, and they invoke curses, or the husband invokes curses on the wife, and then the wife wants to do the same. Muhammad says, "Don't do that," because women aren't supposed to do that. Only men are allowed to do that. But she does it anyway, and then Muhammad says, "Perhaps she will be cursed. Perhaps she'll give birth to a black child with curly hair."
Oh,
I
but
added the word cursed, but that's the implication, right? That she's being cursed, and the curse is going to be that she's going to have black child, curly hair. Your thoughts,
Now,
Floyd?
now it's personal for Haja because they went after the hair too, which is really now it's personal.
I am telling you, man, if Muhammad was alive, I probably would be the end of him. Like literally.
Yeah.
Oh
I mean,
my
this is,
gosh.
these insults are very personal because
Ugh,
in
I
South
am
Africa, apartheid's a long story. We should do a show one day just to annoy people because apartheid is not what people think it is. The South African government was doing a lot of good that has never been acknowledged. But that aside, there was a common sort of statement towards black people, certain groups of black people, that they had peppercorn hair and head like a raisin. You have the idea of the peppercorn hair. So this was a common thing among certain groups. And these ideas, when you see the curly hair, these ideas seem to have cemented themselves into the culture. It seems to have come out of this into the culture. And then also the idea of Muhammad insulting people, this has also made its way into Islamic law within their doctrine of commanding the right. And one of the ways that they need to maintain discipline and force people to do things is to use verbal abuse and insults. And I mean, this is just another example of these insults that have now become entrenched within Islamic culture.
But the sad part, though, have you seen the trend in in the Islamic world among the men, like the younger ones? I would say probably like the 25s to 30ish. They have big curly hair now.
Hmm.
Have you seen it? Like a lot of them, they have
Yeah,
afros.
but that's part of the whole woke phenomenon because white bad black good, and it's, I mean, this is just the whole divide and conquer strategy, right? Because, I mean, who's to say this is not part of Islamic propaganda? Because, oh, Christianity is the religion of slavery. Well, I mean, Muhammad explicitly owned black slaves, sold black slaves. He made black slavery sunnah. If Muhammad did it, I mean, Abbas, would you come on and say that Muhammad's slavery was a sin because slavery is wrong, and therefore Muhammad having slaves, selling slaves, trading slaves, giving away slaves, having sex with slaves was sinful and wrong? Please drop that in the comment. We'd love to see it. That'll be very nice of you if you can say that Muhammad's slavery was wrong. Aisha owned slaves as well. Right? She also owned slaves. And Muslims will not come out and condemn it. They absolutely will not. So, but who's to say that they're not the ones pushing the idea of, we need to create division. We need to create this whole identity politics thing. I mean, who's to say they're not part of the whole group to destroy Western culture that way?
All right, we just have.
Notice slavery is not wrong in that context. You see, they'll defend child abuse. They'll defend pedophilia. They'll defend anything Muhammad did.
It's not wrong in what context? It's not wrong in the context of Muhammad doing it?
Yeah.
Because that's the only thing that makes it different.
And I mean, Islam is nothing but the devil's book. It's literally the devil's book.
So if Muhammad does it, it's not wrong. But of course, what he did is sunnah, so therefore he cannot be, they cannot speak ill of Muhammad. So you got evidence.
So Abbas tried to defend it earlier, but the usual ultimate defense of Muhammad is his so-called farewell sermon, where at least it sometimes claimed that he said the following:
"All mankind."
Fake. Yes, Lloyd, you're jumping ahead of yourself.
Sorry.
All mankind is from Adam and Eve. An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab has any superiority over an Arab. Also, white has no superiority over black, nor a black has any superiority over white, except piety and good action. Learn that every Muslim is a brother to every Muslim, and that the Muslims constitute one brotherhood. Nothing shall be legitimate to a Muslim which belongs to a fellow Muslim unless it is given freely and willingly. Lloyd may have already given away the plot here, that this isn't exactly something Muhammad is actually said, but I first wanted to just take it for granted. Just let's just say that Muhammad actually did say these words. Does this actually contradict the idea of any possibility of him being racist? What are your thoughts, Ayo?
I'm not sure. I'm actually not sure. I want to think about it for a bit because it's my first time seeing this, and I'm not sure. And I don't want to just speak off the cuff, so I want to think about it for a bit.
Yep. Haja, any thoughts from you?
No, I'm not sure what to say about this, but then also, is this one out of how many? And is this Muhammad's actual words? I mean, if this is it, I wouldn't use the word contradicting himself, because he obviously hates the color black, even to the little puppies, the dogs, I don't know what to say about this. Again, maybe this is just a copy paste from another book. I think Lloyd has something. Like, his face looks like he has something.
Yeah, well, it's on the continuation of the slide. Lloyd knows where this is going.
Yeah, I mean, but remember, there's this letter that Muhammad supposedly wrote to this group of monks, which said that, oh, you guys are great, we love you guys, and we're going to look after you guys. You guys are my homies, you guys are my boys. And that was fake. It's 100% fake. It never happened, right? The monks wrote it themselves, and they stuck Muhammad's handprint on it to give themselves some kind of protection, because they would be killed otherwise. So, I mean, this is absolutely fake. I mean, Aga Abbas obviously goes off topic, and then of course,
we're not discussing Exodus, Abbas.
Yeah,
that's not today's subject. If you want to defend your prophet's racism,
but see, Aga Abbas, slavery is not wrong in that context. It's perfectly okay in that context, because if God allowed it, then it's okay. You see. So I don't know why you're complaining about slavery, because besides, those verses in the Bible are all wrong, because that's from the corrupted Bible, You know, so the original Bible said something completely different. So bring us a copy of the uncorrupted Bible if you don't mind. You know, because you're quoting corrupted verses. Thank you.
So
Correct?
the irony here is I haven't mentioned slavery. We were going to get to slavery eventually, but his consciousness is kind of betraying him here. Nothing we've said has related to the treatment of slaves yet. And he's already trying to defend Muhammad's use of slaves, or the Islamic use of slaves. That's the last hadith slide, but we haven't even gotten to that yet. As Lloyd alluded to, this is actually a modern forgery, or sort of. The way that it's worded here, this comes from a 1987 book by S.F.H. Fawzi. That's the first time this hadith was ever, or this version of the last sermon was ever known. If you read the last sermon in
1987.
See,
Yeah.
copy paste.
If you
I'm
read
older than this thing.
if you read the two authentic versions of the last sermon, which the works are eluding me at the moment, and I don't want to misspeak by saying where they are, but if you read the two versions of it, neither one has this. There is something similar, which is presumably where the modern author stole this from, found in not one of the Sahih collections, but a fairly important hadith collection, Musnad Ahmed, but it's not
Ahmad.
spoken.
It's Ahmad. You spelled it wrong. It's Musnad Ahmad.
Yeah, that's a typo. Yeah, you're right. It should be A-H.
Yeah, he's one of the founders of the schools of fiqh. So
yeah. His hadith collection is very extensive. It contains tons and tons of unauthentic hadiths. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But the other thing is it's not spoken at the farewell sermon. It's just spoken at some random time, or attributed to Muhammad at some random time. And if we actually look at these words carefully, what he's actually saying is no Muslim is superior to any other Muslim. It has nothing to do with anything besides that, which is still good. I mean, I don't want to say that this is bad, but the later Muslims, when they're going to justify their racism, they're going to say that the blacks are subhuman. They're going to say that they're inferior, that they're incapable of being true Muslims, and stuff like that, so that they can get around this. And again, this is assuming Muhammad said this. I don't think that he probably did. He didn't say most of the things in the hadith, including most of the racist things we looked at. But pretending he said it, pretending that he said all the things that we looked at today, you can't get around all the other things he said by pointing to this one thing and saying somehow it trumps everything else. He had a good day where he was feeling generous, or maybe this was before Nabtal started making fun of him and he started hating black people. We don't know. This could have been any time, at any place. It could be abrogated, like Lloyd pointed out. Hadith are abrogated all the time, so it doesn't get around the problem. I'll come back to you since you said you wanted to think it over.
No, absolutely. I think it's good. I like what you said about it really only applying to Muslims, and then also this is more of a reach interpretation. But what I was also thinking is in bold, where it says that no black has any superiority over any white except by piety and good action. Well, then you could think, okay, well, what's defined as piety and good action, right? Becoming a Muslim. And so if these people are those like Nabtal who annoyed Muhammad, rebelled against Islam, and went against these teachings and his alleged prophethood, then that could also be justification to then subjugate. I mean, because even if it's not in the context of black and white, you could certainly say it's in the context of subjugating non-Muslims, right? Because in the beginning, it does say that an Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, or vice versa. So if you also take that last part about except by piety and good action and apply it to that as well, with Arabs and non-Arabs, or Muslims and non-Muslims, well, then you could think, okay, those who don't believe, those who don't submit to the will of Allah are those who are inferior, therefore giving them justification to then subjugate them. But that's a whole different rabbit hole, because that goes more into just jihad as a whole. But it is something I noticed. But I like what you said, though, as well, about the time frame, right? I mean, this could have been before Nabtal. This could have been when he was just having a good day. And so one quote in one bubble doesn't really do it justice, when, especially considering that we've already looked at so many.
All right, so this will be our final hadith for today. I left this one to last
Yeah,
because it ties in with
it's really late. I should go. It's
yeah, if you
20
want to
past
drop
1 in
off,
the
Lloyd,
morning
that's
here.
fine. Your call. But this will be the last one that we look at. I left it to last because it ties in with history, but we'll look at the history of Islam post-Muhammad in a part 2, which to be scheduled. So here is the famous hadith about Muhammad buying a white slave for the price of 2 black slaves. A slave came and pledged to the Prophet to emigrate, and the Prophet did not realize he was a slave. Then his master came looking for him. The Prophet said, "Sell him to me," and he bought him for 2 black slaves. Then he did not accept a pledge from anyone until he asked, "Is he a slave?" So I'll get both of your thoughts, and then I'll take some closing words as well. Aya, what are your thoughts on Muhammad buying an individual for the price of 2 other individuals?
It's entirely commensurate with everything that we've seen from him, right? And so, although it's not good, it's morally wrong, it's evil. It's not in the least bit, not in the least bit shocking. I remember a while back when I had done a video, there was another source I had cited where it was saying that he's treated his slaves extremely rigorously. Whenever they would go on their journeys or travel, he would have 1 or 2 in particular basically carry the entire load of all of their cargo, everything that they had, and he was extremely relentless in his treatment of them. And so the fact that he bought slaves here, I mean, it's crazy because most of the Muslim world either doesn't know this or doesn't want to acknowledge it because they're not being told, or they just want to suppress it, And so it's crazy to think about Muhammad doing something like this because he'd be, canceled today, obviously, right? But this doesn't get focused on, this doesn't get acknowledged. So not in the least bit surprising, but still reprehensible. Absolutely.
Your thoughts, Haja? I think you might be muted.
I don't think she is.
Doesn't say you're muted. Go ahead and try again.
Can you hear us?
Maybe she can't hear us.
Weird.
We'll blame Lloyd signing off and messed up the connection.
Oh,
yeah, she
something
can't
with
hear
the
us.
earbuds. Okay, gotcha. Alrighty.
Alrighty. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing this. Like I said, we have many. I have many, much more. We're kind of just looking at the beginning here. We're looking at Muhammad because it's the most important. This is it's probably more than half the slides, but it's not nearly half the racism. Let's put it that way. that what we find in the later sources it takes this idea of Muhammad and it runs with it, and we find Muslim after Muslim justifying their treatment of Black people who they've captured and conquered as the Islamic Empire has expanded. Actually, let me pull that hadith back up because it is actually relevant here. But Muhammad says at the end, he says that, or the hadith writer, not Muhammad, says that after this incident, then Muhammad stopped taking pledges. Like someone came to Muhammad and they said, "I want to be a Muslim," right? And they said, "I want to commit to you as my prophet." And he's like, "Great, I love new followers." And then he found out he was a slave and it cost him money. And so then he stopped accepting pledges until after he'd asked someone if they were a slave or not. If he's really the perfect, most merciful man and mercy to all mankind, why is he concerned about his own financial stress being put on him by accepting pledges from slaves? Very interesting there.
Well said.
And again, he bought this one slave, it doesn't specify, Arab, European, whatever, slave, from the slave owner for 2 black slaves. Apparently those 2 black slaves were not Muslims. He didn't have a problem owning black slaves that were not Muslims. because that's the whole point here, that once the guy became a Muslim, then he couldn't be treated as a slave anymore. And that's the dilemma that the Muslims are going to have when they're expanding their empire and they're wanting to take slaves for various reasons, is they know that when someone becomes a Muslim, they're supposed to be treated equally. But until they're a Muslim, hey, you can treat them however you want. And in fact, you should treat them poorly, according to many of these sources, because they deserve it. They're just animals. And if you don't treat them like animals, then it's just going to create problems. So that's what to look forward in the next chat. Any closing thoughts from you guys?
No, I think we covered it all pretty nicely. Yeah, a lot of the things I had wanted to talk about were more about like slavery as a whole. So definitely looking forward to part 2 and just being able to explore that and how we see it manifest, even in modern day examples as well. So absolutely.
Excellent. I don't know if Haja can hear us now, but if she can, what are your closing thoughts?
I don't think so.
Let me try messaging her. All right. I don't think that she can't hear us and she didn't get the message, but no worries. We'll get more of her thoughts next time around. Thank you for joining us today. I have some more activities on my plate this evening. It was nominally scheduled for 7:30. Probably going to push that back a tiny bit, since that's 3 minutes from now. I'll have my regular Bible study, and I'll post a link to that in the chat momentarily. Then on Monday, I'll be live with David Wood. He has agreed to come on my channel. We'll be discussing the future of Christianity, the future of Islamic and Christian relations, polemics, whatever you want to call it, and get an update on his own plans as well. Until then, I hope to see a few of you tonight for the Bible study, and to the rest of you, see you Monday or next time you're able to tune into one of these. Have a great evening. God bless.